Hey, Chris.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Doing well. Really excited for this, man. This is awesome.
Yeah, I'm likewise. I'm pretty pumped that there's Descartes back to back. It's quite a Saturday afternoon, I gotta say that. I see
Oh,
you're
I gotta.
rocking the bookshelves that you put together. Those are pretty
Yeah.
cool.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was fun to try to do something way out of my wheelhouse.
They came out good. I like
Well,
the
thanks.
I don't know, exposed piping kind of vibe.
Yeah, I'm a fan too. Really happy with how they turned out. It was surprisingly easy um, to put together. Pretty cool all around,
Yeah, yeah.
and way more storage than I had before. So that's also really nice.
Yeah. The search of inevitable bookshelf space is an issue.
Yeah. I'm already scheming my next round of them too. So
I've been separated from about half my books for over a year now. So in August, I'm excited to be reunited with some of them.
excellent. With some of them, not even all of them.
Oh, well, I have the other half with me. So I will
Oh,
be
okay.
reunited with some of them because the other some are with me.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Hi, Daniel.
Sarah, hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
It's going. How are you?
Not bad, not bad.
Yeah, it's nice to see you. See your
I know
face.
you too. It's good to see your face. It's been way, way, way too long.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to you being reunited with the books because that means you will also be reunited with me. In
There,
Milwaukee.
there's a jar of margarita with our names on it.
Excellent. I'm so excited about so much Descartes between the
Yeah,
two.
we've got some discourse, we've got some meditations. What more hyperbolic doubt do you need it in an afternoon?
Not much more, I suppose.
Well, would you like to give people another minute, or should we kick things off?
Um, I suppose we could maybe give it one more minute. I've got
Cool.
quite some competition, so I was kind of expecting it might be a smaller group, but that's okay. I'd rather have something intimate and productive than something large for its own sake. So,
Sure. Well, we might have some followers on YouTube, so
oh yeah. Hello, YouTube audience.
I was super confused about getting the passcode thing. So there could also be people being like, what? There's a passcode? So could
Yeah, that took me a second too. I was like, I almost sent Chris a DM and Twitter, and I bet there's a thing on the email.
Yeah, I did the same thing. I was like, fuck, I don't know what this is. This can't be right. I should go back to the other room and ask everyone. But
Yeah, because the first one didn't ask for the passcode, right?
all about scrolling to the bottom of the email and reading the whole thing.
I know. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I think we all know what we're here for, but nonetheless, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend and outstanding colleague Daniel Collette, who I believe is currently at Marquette. Apparently, soon to be reunited with half of his books. And he's going to be explaining to us today why exactly it is that the provisional moral code in Descartes' discourse is fake news. So the way these things go, as I understand it, is we'll give you about 15 minutes to kind of talk through your ideas, but it's pretty flexible. We have a small group, so I hope we can have kind of a robust discussion afterwards. So take it away, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Chris, for sharing. It's really good to see you. With conferences like being dead for like a year and a half, like it sucks because you don't get to catch up with people and hang out and all the things that you would normally do at a conference. So I'm glad to at least do it virtually. And Sarah and Phil, thank you for being here. I know that there were 2 other sessions that looked quite interesting, and somehow you ended up at mine. So thank you for that. Just to give a little bit of background, this article has its seeds in my dissertation, which I defended way back in 2016. And of course, since then I've changed my thesis some while honing in on it significantly. But really, I've been working on this damn thing on and off for 5 years now. So it's gone through many drafts, some of which have been sent to journal submissions. Many others have had friends and colleagues look them over. And I think I've discarded and completely rewritten this thing at least 4 times now. And so part of the problem is that I've never been so confident in a thesis. Like, I will fight to the death over this thesis, but how to present all the pieces in an article eludes me. So today I'm going to start off by painting a big picture, and I'm happy to get into any details that you want to. I'm more than happy to do that. But at least for my part, it would be most helpful to focus on 2 things. The first is the big picture of how to organize everything into one coherent, nicely flowing article. And then second is just how to package it. What's the so what of my paper? Because I've had reviewers in more or less words respond with, so who cares? And that's usually not something you want to read from a reviewer. And so that would also be helpful. So, well, what is my thesis then? Well, Descartes' ethical theory has definitely been trending over the past few decades after centuries of neglect. So the earliest Cartesians actually cared a fair amount about Descartes' ethics. When Descartes' letters were first published right after his death, the first ones were his correspondence with Elizabeth, which has an ethics in it. But since then, it really hasn't been talked about until fairly recently, in philosophy standards, fairly recently. His ethics have gone viral with researchers reconstructing it through related work. So there's a discourse on method, passions of the soul, and then he's DMing with mutuals like Princess Elizabeth Chenot, who's the French ambassador, and Queen Christina. So specifically, these scholars, in terms of the discourse on method, like to appeal to part 3 of the discourse. And in part 3, Descartes introduces a provisional morality, a morale par provision, to just insult the French language in my pronunciation. And this provisional morality is a list of rules for living well. So to follow the laws and customs of his country, adhering to state religion, constancy, to act as firmly and resolutely as he can once he forms an opinion, to conquer himself rather than trying to change his fortune in the world, change his desires rather than changing the order of the world. And then he's not really quite sure whether he should label the 4th one a maxim or not. So he adds as a 3rd, maybe 4th maxim, to choose a vocation. And here he maintains that the best life is still a life of reason. And he's content with following the philosophical method he describes in part 2 as a means of achieving that life of reason. So all the reply guides love to characterize these rules as an authoritative account of Descartes' early ethics. And these interpretations have different instantiations, but they all argue that Descartes' morale was in some way or another a seed, an early framework, or a commitment to a particular ethical view. I don't think that Descartes really cares about ethics at all in the discourse. And so hear me out here. The discourse is split into 6 parts, and it's accepted among scholars that the skepticism in parts 1, 2, and the beginning of 4 draws heavily from the writing of Montaigne and Pierre Chiron. So all the big blue check influencers have painstakingly outlined how closely parts 1, 2, and the start of 4 follow those Renaissance skeptics. By today's standards, it's nearly plagiarism at points how closely he follows them. Yet somehow part 3 is overlooked. So basically what's being said is Descartes is doing all this work on skepticism in parts 1 and 2. He stops for this intermission in part 3 to talk about ethics, but then he remembers that skepticism is why people are following him, so he picks back up with the skepticism in part 4 and continues on. But if we remember, the skeptics aren't doubting for its own sake, right? They're not some dark web trolls screwing with epistemology. They suspend judgment as a means to ataraxia, to find tranquility, peace, happiness, living well, however you want to package it. So it's no real surprise that when Descartes starts copying the skeptics, if he follows them so closely as we know that he does, that he would copy them completely. It's not a real shocker that this could happen. So I believe he isn't writing about ethics for his own sake, but rather simply concluding the skeptical part of the discourse and its practical advice for living well in tranquility when in doubt. So said differently, part 3 offers a path for tranquility, living under the conditions of a suspended judgment, just like any good skeptic. And once he reaches this end of skepticism, in both senses of end here, so the final part of the skeptical project, as well as describing the goal of that final part, ataraxia, he pivots away from skepticism to certitude with the cogito in part 4. So it makes sense that part 3 would flow naturally from part 2 and into part 4. And textually, part 3 follows from Montaigne and Chiron as closely as he does in parts 1 and 2. And rather than writing an ethics that he cares about, Descartes is literally just role-playing as a skeptic in parts 1, 2, and 3, and the beginning of part 4. He drops the morale from the meditations because he realizes he doesn't need that part of his skepticism for methodological doubt. And I think more importantly, because metaphysical doubt, so the evil genius, is so hyperbolic that it would upend those rules for morality anyway. So what's the problem here? Again, the organizing and the so what are really what's crippling me here. And there's several pieces to my article that are like pieces of the puzzle that I need to put together. So I'm just going to skim through those chunks because they all talk to my thesis and they're what I'm trying to organize. And then I'm going to, like I said, skim through them, but I'm happy to pause and go back to any of them to fill in any gaps or questions or anything. So the first is there's Montaigne and Chiron. I need to show explicitly where Descartes draws his provisional morality from. There are parts that are explicitly copied from Montaigne's essays and Chiron's wisdom, and I'm more than glad to share some quotes that illustrate that. I've recently considered using a table for this, but tables are touchy. You can't have a paper that's half tables because tables are illustrative, they don't speak for themselves. The second piece is Descartes is silent about ethics. So as evidence for my position, he doesn't really care about ethics for almost all of his life. He just doesn't talk about it. And normally I would be cautious about an argument from silence. Evidence of lacking of evidence isn't evidence of lacking. But he talks about almost everything else in his correspondence. Before he writes to Elizabeth, he DMs dozens of people about almost every philosophical topic other than ethics, metaphysics, the sciences, philosophical methodology, scientific methods, mechanics, medicine, I already said metaphysics, just about everything else. He even begs his rich friends for money to do experiments or to do experiments for him, but not a word about ethics. There's only 2 exceptions. And in those exceptions, he makes it clear he's not interested in ethics. And I'd be glad to get into those 2 exceptions if you want. The third piece of the puzzle is less central, but I at least want to mention it here right now, is that there's a lot of literature on the morale par provision. My thesis, I believe, sidesteps all of it. But inevitably, I have reviewers saying that I don't mention this or that viral post, but those are quite relevant. But those articles aren't quite relevant to what I'm saying. So some scholars say it's genuinely provisional, some say it's not, but all take it seriously in some sense in a way that I just don't. And sometimes the best solution here is just to ignore reviewer number 2 and resubmit it somewhere else. But it is something I've gotten as comments, so I'm just throwing it out there. And then the final pieces of the puzzle are a series of objections that I think must be addressed in order to properly defend my claim. So the first of those objections is that in part 2, Descartes offers rules of method that he claims will lead us to indubitable knowledge. So the provisional morality is derived from those, not from the skeptics. I reply that in part 3, he maintains the metaphor of tearing down an old house to rebuild a new one from parts 1 and 2. And he starts part 3 by saying it's provisional until something better has been built. I think Descartes is really clear here. Most of this interpretation comes from a paper that I'm hesitant to go on record, but I'm going to say it. I think is painfully bad, probably one of the worst philosophy papers I've ever read, that says the 4 rules of method correlate specifically with the 4 oral maxims. They don't. But I think to go here is just too much for my article, but still there's that objection, generally speaking. The second objection is years later when he's writing with Elizabeth, he revisits these 4 rules as advice for living well. And I reply here that he really only seems to do this last minute. So Elizabeth is having a hard life. She's exiled, she's physically ill, her life sucks. And so Descartes, like for once in his life, actually shows empathy to one of his correspondents and says, I'm so sorry you're having a hard time. Why don't you read some Seneca to help you find some peace? But then he himself reads Seneca. He realizes, like, I haven't read Seneca since I was an undergrad, and that was a really bad idea because I disagree with half of what Seneca is saying. So he has to go back and try to cover his tracks without admitting he was too wrong, because Descartes doesn't like to do that. And he's searching for something to tell her in response to Seneca. And well, the only other time he's even mentioned ethics in the past 8 years was the provisional morality. So he grasps for it, but even then he rewrites these rules in terms of certainty. So they're not the same rules. They're very similar, they're related, but they're not the same. The third objection is that Descartes sounds really stoic at points in the rules, so he's not following the skeptics. And I agree with the part that he sounds really stoic, but that doesn't mean that he's not following the skeptics. So to elaborate on that, Montaigne and Chiron are, as typical of the time, quite eclectic. Chiron is especially as much of a neo-stoic as he is a skeptic. So I contend that Descartes isn't really bothering to draw careful distinctions here. Really just don't overthink it. He's copying Montaigne and Chiron, and as such, some stoicism gets snuck in. But that doesn't mean he's trying to be a stoic. He's still role-playing the skepticism in the way that Chiron and to some extent Montaigne do. And then the fourth and final objection, and the last piece of this puzzle here that I'm trying to put together, is that Descartes doesn't mention rules for living well in the Meditations, so it's not just copying the skeptics. And I hinted at this earlier, but I think this only reinforces my point. So Descartes is clear in the introduction to the Meditations, in the edit that he makes in concession to Arnaud, that he specifically isn't talking about ethics. And he realizes that he doesn't need that. Well, I don't need to repeat myself, but I will just to wrap it up since I started it. He realizes he doesn't need that part of skepticism for his methodological doubt. And with metaphysical doubt, it's so hyperbolic that those rules just wouldn't matter anyway. So he just can get rid of them. And so we see a development from the discourse to the Meditations of him based on comments in the discourse, refining and strengthening his arguments on skepticism. And in that, it just kind of falls away, the part on ataraxia, because that's not what he's trying to get at. That was some fat that he had to trim off, and he's good to go with that. So that's where I'm at. Those are the pieces of my paper. I would love any suggestions you have on the so what, and also on how to fit these together coherently. Including like how do you compare the text without it all being tables. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions if something, if you were curious about something or if a point bothered you, I'm happy to chat about that as well. So thanks for listening.
Okay, I'm gonna turn it over, open it up, I guess I should say. I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't want to, as a chair, I'll defer to our guests first.
I welcome them all the thoughts.
You said that you had, I think it was 2 points where Descartes mentions some sort of ethics, and you said that maybe you could share those. Could you?
Sure. Yeah. So the first exception I briefly alluded to later, but that's where he subtweets Arnaud. So basically, Descartes writes the Meditations, and then he gets the objections and replies. And one of Arnaud's objections is has to deal with whether, when Descartes talks about the will, whether he's talking about willing good and evil. And Descartes just doesn't care about that. His willing has to do with the methodological doubt and things like that. So he revises the introduction to the Meditations to explicitly say he's not talking about willing good and evil. The second is he has a letter to Pelot, where he says the provisional morality is something that will be gone and forgotten soon because there will be something new and better. So, I think that second letter does support my point, but at the very least it says that this isn't some profound seed that expands. It's something that is very much disposable, that he isn't very attached to.
I have some like sets of questions, but they're like larger than your project, I think, and then more like, I don't know, I have technical things about how you could possibly organize it. But I mean, so despite being fairly well versed in some early modern folks, Descartes scholarship not as much. So I guess I don't even, is it like a really big push of people being like, no, there's totally an ethics here. We have all of these resources to talk about it. That's just like first, I mean, you're nodding, so I feel like I can continue talking.
Right.
Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, I guess I'm a little bit interested in these, like the 3 criticisms that you were talking about. I believe it was 3. And the way that you were talking about them as like maybe being something you didn't want to include. And 3 criticisms are 3, I'm forgetting what word you even used. And I guess first I'm just like wondering why you said you might not want to include them.
So are you talking about me engaging with the contemporary literature?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of it, and almost all of it is making the case that the provisional morality is something that is a seed. So, and this is really a popular view. I want to say it's the view that's in vogue, but that sounds in a way dismissive or insulting. I'm not trying to sound dismissive or insulting, but it's the popular view. It's the view that a lot of the, I guess, middle generation of scholars, so not like quite the Garber area, but like the next generation between me and them have been, many of them have been espousing. And so a lot of it is that there, and I'm sorry that I'm stumbling over my words a little bit. And the reason why is that there's a lot of discussion in this literature. And really it comes down to a few people saying it really is provisional, meaning Descartes really meant this, but it was only intended to be a stopgap until he introduces certainty. And then all the other literature is saying, well, no, when he says provisional, he means something else. One popular reading is that it's a legal term that's like a down payment. But either way, that it's some sort of seed or early instantiation of his ethics. And my problem with engaging too much of this in the paper is that there's certain assumptions there about what's happening that I'm questioning those fundamental assumptions. And so if I were to get into those, I feel like I'd be accepting some of those assumptions that I'm trying to undermine. And so I don't know, maybe it might be worthwhile to make that explicit, like outline, these are the assumptions that are made, and these are what, and I'm questioning those. That might be a way to sidestep it without making it look like I'm unaware of it or unnecessarily ignoring it.
This is part of where I was going. Is like, I mean, it seems like even though I don't know a ton of that literature, most of the secondary literature, contemporary literature I know about Descartes is just about mind-body stuff. But which for other reasons makes sense. That is what I know about. But anyways, that's not here nor there. But that does seem like a good way to like open up and then delimit those things while still acknowledging that they're there and that they're like obviously an important set of commitments that people have about ethics and morality. I did want to ask though, like, and this one is a really naive, like super, like, very naive question. So like, you said that, until he introduces certainty, but is what in introducing certainty for this like group of folks who are reading Descartes this way, does that like replace? So it's like a place is a seed and then a placeholder certainty. We are like, we have morality only because we have like some sort of like a good knowledge, or is it then just replacing it, like the ethics there? Does that make sense to ask that in a way that made sense?
No. That makes perfect sense. So again, the literature here is vast, which I like this idea of addressing the assumptions that unite them, because that's a way to not get sidetracked down that path. But oh man, my memory is embarrassingly bad. Sometimes I start talking and I forget where I am mid-sentence. Can you
I do that all the time.
one or two words say?
I just was asking about this, like, and maybe this is like something I can just ask you about when we're not in this, because it is more of a question, I guess, about the other literature. But like, if people are saying that ethics, I mean, it's like the provisional morality is a placeholder rather than a seed for future morality. Is that certainty? Is it like, are we just saying, is that like people being like, well, actually Descartes doesn't care about morality because he's using it as a placeholder until we get like some sort of like I don't know, true justified belief or something like that. But I wasn't sure if I understood that part. And if you are saying, coming back to like what your thesis is, that is like wrong, and maybe two sets of, what I heard, two sets of literature sort of arguing similar things, but one is saying that it's the seed, the others are saying it's being replaced. Like, are you saying that like that's just not the case? Like we don't care about this, or Descartes doesn't care about this, and what certainty is or not sort of is missing.
I got you. Thank you. So in the stopgap reading, which was the reading that was assumed for a long time, it would say that he meant it genuinely, but it's a way we can live until he finalizes his, well, in the introduction to the principles, he talks about the tree of philosophy, where you need to have the roots of metaphysics, the trunk of physics, then the branches with its fruit, which are medicine, mechanics, and morals. And so basically, until you get to that fruit, you need some way to guide your life. And that's what the stopgap is of the provisional morality. The other says, no, he's offering a broad sketch of how we should live. And then when he comes up with certainty, he fills in the gaps, but these broad strokes of how we should live remain the same. He has something quasi-stoic, and he maintains that view from the discourse up until the end. Whether he means it in the first sense, to some extent, I think is beside the point. I don't really take it too seriously, but I do think that the second point is untenable based on that he's literally just role-playing as a skeptic. But I don't want to get too much into either of those, because again, that's a whole nother paper that's more of, I don't know, it might be more of a literature review than it would be trying to say what I'm trying to say. It is a
Yeah, I mean, so I guess like in thinking about like the structure of the paper, I think that what you just said is like what you have to say about that. Like, I'm not trying to do that. Here's what they do. I'm saying that that's like maybe neither here nor there, or it's untenable, but that is a separate thing. And this is what I'm doing. It's a really good way to be like, here, I know it all. I'm showing you it all, but I'm now putting it in a nice little bow and putting it over there until somebody else wants to open it. And then I can keep going on about, like, who cares about that particular part?
right. No, that's really helpful. Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Okay, so a couple things. So I think I can maybe help with the who cares objection, which I always find frustrating to get, especially from like historians of philosophy.
I can. You should
Yeah,
too.
exactly, right? Like, come on. I mean, there are some cases where I occasionally feel that as well, but minimally, like, I mean, a lot of what we're doing, who cares? We're philosophers. Come on now. But so one thing, and this is really, I feel grimy doing this, but one thing that you might do is this paper I'm giving later this afternoon and another paper I have coming out, both kind of make the case that actually Descartes has more of a sort of Socratic bent in terms of his philosophical outlook than people realize, right? So, you know, I'm glad you mentioned the principles, because that was the first thing I thought. You know, he talks about the fruit of the tree, and one of the things that I stress in a paper is, you know, look, he says explicitly, like, the fruit is the thing that matters, right? We need the roots, we need the trunk, but at the end of the day, like, you want fruit. That's the thing that is the sort of principal importance here. And so all of this other stuff is background so that we can do the stuff that really matters. And obviously when he says morals, you know, he means it in the 17th century sense, which is just kind of like anything applied. But that includes ethics, right? Because when we're doing applied stuff, it's about trying to live well, which is also why I think he's worried about medicine. You know, I think it would be way off topic and way too difficult to try to make this historical case, but you know, we know his daughter died young, and it seems like he turned a lot of attention to physiology in an attempt to kind of try to like fix some of that stuff. And so it seems to me that, you know, insofar as he's concerned with trying to live well, or he thinks at least that that's the sort of most important upshot of what philosophy is or can be, that gives you, I think, some room to say, like, well, here's why we ought to care, because that's the real project, right? Like, all of this other stuff is set up for the stuff that really matters. And that's my own take on it. And so maybe you can, you know, kind of do with that what you will. But I think that's something that you can kind of lean on to motivate maybe a little bit more clearly why we ought to take seriously whether he has a moral code, provisional or otherwise.
Right. Yeah. Oh, thank you.
So that's something I think that's valuable. I don't know if he does have an ethics, but I think he does care about it. You know, for all these reasons. And then what else did I want to say, maybe more directly? The last sort of objection you brought up. So you brought up these 4 objections. So no rules for living well in the meditations. Yeah, I think that's a really easy solution. And I think maybe this especially because, again, like I'm giving a paper about this later. That's not what the meditations is for. That just fundamentally misunderstands it. He's appropriating basically mystical pedagogical literature in an attempt to get people into the right kind of mindset to approach doing philosophy systematically and carefully and well. but this is all like super groundwork stuff. It's not, we're not even at a point where we're supposed to be doing anything applied or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I do think at the end of meditation 6, what appears to be the sort of weird digression through anatomy and things like that, which takes up way too much space in what seems to be a text about how mind and body are separate, is an important part of the puzzle. And I think what he's up to there ultimately is sort of a part of the mystical tradition that is underattended to, which is after the mystical experience, you return as a transformed individual. And so I think that also plays into it, right? Alignment of the will, as you brought up, is like alignment with God's will, which is why the sort of discussion, I think, about whether he's a libertarian or a compatibilist is just confused. Let's stop talking about that. It's alignment with the divine will, full stop. And so again, like that, I think carries with it a moral component as well, even if it's sort of an indirect route to it. So I think there is kind of like, there's moral implications, even if he doesn't have a system. So I'm just dumping thoughts on you at the moment.
Yeah.
There's not really
bring them on, dump away.
And so, you know, I'm doing that awful thing that people do at talks where it's like, well, what do you think about that? But yeah. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. I'm definitely sympathetic to what you're saying, especially with the meditations. It's ethics, or really anything applied, it just isn't what Descartes is up to. And I think he's painfully clear about that. And I think any readings that try to say that he is, it's completely reading back into it. Which is why I love at least some contextual components, because it brackets that. But I guess I definitely, he agrees about the medicine throughout his life. He starts talking about that early. And there's definitely some connection with the medicine and morals because of his physiology. Your disposition can affect your body. But in terms of like how to live well, something that we would carve out as morals today, he just doesn't really seem to talk about that, which is part of, and I guess I'm bringing that up just because I think that is important to what I'm saying. And I don't know, maybe I do need to get into that more, because if he's just role playing, then it's not really something that's on his mind, right? So he does talk about all kinds of other things, including medicine, but then in terms of morality, properly speaking, it's absent. I'm just not really sure of how much I should go into that, how much I should frame it. One thing is that so many of these points that I'm going through require some certain assumptions that I think the text makes explicitly clear, like the meditation just shouldn't be read that way, but there's so much literature that says otherwise, that in order for it to be a good paper, you can't just outright assume that. But that's part of where I get back to of having trouble with fitting these pieces of the puzzle together, where I really don't want to go down those paths of, delving too much into secondary literature on some of these points that are just background to what I'm trying to say. And I don't know, maybe this is one of those cases where footnote goes a long way, but it just, I really just don't know. This is one of the things I've been caught up on.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
Sorry, Chris or Christopher, I don't know what you prefer to go by. Obviously, you probably have more like content questions about Descartes, since you know Descartes better. But I guess I'm just like wondering, even though maybe I should know this, but like, But after hearing you respond, I'm like, what do you mean by ethics and morality now? Because I mean, I was like, okay, I'm on board, all right. But now I'm like, well, so, I mean, we can look to other figures in the same time period and be like, yeah, they don't really have ethics either, or like a morality like broadly understood, because the way they're thinking about what it means to live life well isn't like a code of morality. So maybe something that could be helpful, at least for me right now to understand, but also in the framing of the paper. Because if you're saying he doesn't have it, well, what is it that he doesn't have? And then that could be a way of being like, but what he does have is a care about how our bodies work and how we can understand our physiology and conform to God's will, or, all these different things that could be something that other people would be like, well, I'm going to object because that is morality. But if that's not what you mean by morality, then he doesn't have it. So that's a suggestion. And the question is, can you tell me what you mean?
Yeah, so really all that I mean is rules for living well in ways that are not explicitly medical, although later on he does blur the lines between the two. I think it might be fair to say, and Chris, I'd be interested, if you have any thoughts here, but I think it'd be fair to say that early on he draws a sharper distinction than he does later on. And I think part of that is, again, he just doesn't really think about living well, properly speaking, until later on. And then later on, he realizes, given the physiology he's developed, that, oh wait, living well is going to require health, mental well-being is going to be largely physiological and ethical in different ways. So I guess I would say that it is largely about just living, how to live well. And I think that's the sense that the skeptics largely made it as well.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that, Sarah, because I think that was what I was trying to figure out how to ask exactly. Because I think, and maybe I'm reading into it because I want this to be true, but I think when I read the sort of older skeptics or the Stoics or whatever, right, it seems like the aim is not just like accept reality because it just is the way it is, or it's a divine being or something. Like the whole idea is that we need to get clearer about the metaphysics so that we can figure out how to avoid suffering. And so I take it that even if Descartes is kind of role-playing as a skeptic, trying to adapt methodological skepticism to this new worldview, and how can we square, mechanistic physics with whatever else is going on, and physiology. Like, again, it seems like, well, why? It's not just because, we want to score points on the scholastics, though it's fun to dunk on Aquinas, right? Like, cool. But that I don't think that's it. And I think thinking about, as you said, as you said earlier, like contextualizing, thinking about what was going on at the time. Europe is in like every form of crisis imaginable. And so like, well, how do we figure out how to avoid suffering, right? And so maybe framing it in that way and saying like, it's not a moral code as we think about it today. It's not like he's doing contemporary meta ethics. But still, this is all kind of in service of like, how do we survive in this sort of horrifying world that we find ourselves? And I think that could be a useful way of framing it also, because there is a temptation, I think, especially given kind of later modern figures, to want to say, he's got this robust moral system, and he's I don't know, like Cunning talks about him as basically being Spinoza. He's just engaged in this Stoic project. I think you're right. He's not a Stoic. He doesn't have a system in that sense, but it does seem to me that there's sort of a bigger something underlying the general program here. And so I think getting clear on the scope of your thesis would also really help.
Right. Yeah, I think one thing that's nice about this thesis is I do think in everything that the literature is saying, within a few exceptions, like that one article, there's hints of what I think is right in it. But each one misses the mark significantly in one way or another, like accounting for the stoicism. It's definitely there. And it would be, we ought not just to ignore it, but I really think it's just coming along with the package. If you have Sharon, who's this skeptical neo-Stoic, you're going to get some Stoic themes that are snuck in with the doubt. And if it's something that he doesn't really care so much about, then it explains why it's something that will be absolutely thrown away when there's certainty that's provided, things like that. So I do think it, in that sense, maybe as part of the who cares too, there's all these different views that I think largely get a little bit right, and it puts them all together in a nice coherent package. If I can make my paper a nice coherent package.
What time does this go until?
We go for another 15 minutes formally, but I think we have an hour break in between.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask another question. Just wanted to make sure I wasn't like, Daniel, you're trapped. Again, my question isn't I'm sorry, I'm not asking like better questions about your thesis or
No,
like.
this is great. I really appreciate all the comments and questions.
Mine then now, so this is just a question. I've written it down on my notes that I wrote for myself while you're talking, which I can't read, but this one I can read. About, you did say, you're like, well, I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate some of this stuff from Montaigne and Charon. I don't know. Yes. Okay. But you were talking about like including tables as a way of sort of maybe saving space, sidestepping stuff. Of course, tables don't speak for themselves. As you maybe know from my Twitter, I've been working for a math professor this summer and reading a ton of social science papers and math papers, and all the figures at first were very confusing to me, but you know, you actually can like be like, as figure blah 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 indicates, like do some space saving stuff. It seems like it would be maybe like out of place for some history of philosophy articles, but I mean, having comparative tables with quotes like that could be, I mean, I think it would be interesting, and it's like something to refer to rather than spending time pulling each quote and explaining the quote and like but I don't know. I mean, I think it would be interesting. That's all. I guess that's not a question, it's a comment.
Well, I appreciate your more of a comment than a question, just because that was something that I recently thought of because I was reading an article on Hobbes that was comparing his elements of law with his on Citizen, and they had a table that was really helpful. And what I've been trying in the past in various forms was something like, this is what Descartes says, this is what Montaigne says, this is what Sharon says. And for like a paragraph that can be fine, but by the time you're on like 4 pages of that, it's the most dreadful thing to read ever. And at some point it becomes like, well, this isn't even an article as much as just a list of quote comparisons with minor commentary. Whereas if there was a table, it would take away all those quote comparisons and consolidate them, and actually probably a more efficient form because people could see side by side who's saying what and what the parallels are. I guess part of my concern there, and I would love all of your thoughts on this, is how far to take that. So I really believe most, if not all, of the 4 rules, the 4 maxims, are taken either explicitly or by paraphrasing things that Sharon and Montaigne said. But that in itself would be like, in tables, like 8-10 pages. And I don't really think that that's necessary. So I want to make my case as strongly as possible that he is drawing extremely closely, in fact, just as closely as he is from he does in parts 1 and 2, in part 3. But there's certainly a point where it stops being effective. So I don't know. I don't know if I should like just focus on the first maxim and then say the others also follow in similar ways, or if I should pull out highlights from the 4 maxims and say these are examples, but if you this is throughout. I've been hesitant to do either of those just because I really feel like, well, it's a bit of a hot take. My audience is going to be probably not sympathetic to what I'm saying. And so if I don't really explain it, if I just kind of hand wave after a couple of examples, they're going to be suspicious. But I can't have 8 pages of tables without any commentary in between. And so I'm not really sure where to draw that line. I don't know if any of you have any thoughts, but I would definitely welcome them.
Is this a common reading of those maxims?
I would be the first person to ever say this in a publication. Well established that parts 1 and 2 in the beginning of 4 are, like, we've known that since like the early 20th century. Edine Gisson wrote this phenomenal commentary on the discourse. And he has all kinds of endnotes and footnotes showing like these are the parts where he explicitly takes from Montaigne and Chiron in parts 1, 2, and the beginning of the work. But no one's really talked about part 3 in this way. Even even Gisson, which is crazy to me because he refers vaguely to like Stoics and stuff when going through part 3, but he was clearly reading the Chiron and Montaigne that's there, and so I don't really get why he didn't see those connections, but he's explicitly pulling from them. Like sometimes it's literally verbatim.
So to me it seems like in crafting that you could be like this, well-established thing coming from this person. Let's dig into 3 and like do a table of 3, because then you're still doing that, but you're at least you sidestep some of that work, and if 3 is where you are making that argument, then make the argument about 3.
Well, that's what I mean. Even in part 3, I could have like 8 pages of tables because let's see, in the like in the original, we've got like 1, 2, 3, 4. Actually, that's not. Let me get to the rules here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About 6 pages of quotes or of material just from Descartes, and then you're comparing that with 2 other figures, which is going to make the columns on the table narrower, right? Rows, columns on the table narrower. And so I don't think I can or should go into every parallel in part 3 with the corresponding text in Montaigne or Chiron. But I think that it's there. So the 2 that have crossed my mind that I'm not thrilled with is cover just one of the 4 maxims in detail, or pull highlights from the 4 and just hope they take my word for it that there's more in there. And I don't know if one of those would be better or if there's another option, but that's where my brainstorming is led best.
So I'm wondering if there's not some way that you can kind of split the difference here. Is there a possibility that you could, I don't know, maybe go through one of the maxims in detail and then either footnote or add like an appendix or something to say, listen here, I'm not going to bog down the sort of narrative in this paper by doing everything all the way through. But neither am I going to ask that you just trust me that this actually works, right? Maybe there's some way, if you decide to go footnote or something, you could just say like, okay, here are the sort of citations, go look for yourself. Or if you decide to do an appendix, you could just kind of have the different columns and sort of throw that at the end, and or something like that. That way you're not, it's not just a 9-page figure in the middle of a paper. I mean, I don't know. I mean, because it seems to me that you could do something along the lines of like, yeah, go look for yourself. I've done the legwork once. Here, I'll point you to the sort of passages. You go look for yourself. We do that all the time with other sorts of things.
Right.
Descartes says, hey, the eternal truths are wacky. See here, 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 and here. Go look. Right. I'm not going to give you all of the passages because that is a book unto itself. But like, here's the citations. So maybe you could pull something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. Sorry, I dropped my pencil. No, that's. I really like that. I think that might be a way. So I could have selections from the 4, maybe some ones that are particularly strong, and then just have like a massive footnote or an appendix, like where I thoroughly go through it. And to some extent, it will be difficult to do that perfectly, just because it's like selections from those pages. But again, like if I'm doing enough legwork, like you can surely, if you're reading this paper, you're smart enough to connect some of those pieces on your own. So I really like that. I think that might be the way to go there. And then, like you're saying, Sarah, if I start off saying like following Gisa, like this, I'm not just pulling things out of the hat here. Like we all accept that parts 1 and 2 are drawn from here. Let's look at part 3. Here's some greatest hits. Don't just take my word for it. Check out this 3-page footnote and go from there. I think that will. I think that could work really, really well. Actually, I feel really good about this part now. Thank you. This has been a part that has really particularly annoyed me, and has been one of the reasons why it's been disposed and written a couple of times.
It sounds like such an ambitious, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Sometimes when people say that, they're being underhanded. I mean, it sounds super ambitious. Like there's several different things that could themselves just be different papers. But as someone who does this myself, like putting those all together sounds like such hard work. But I mean, it sounds super interesting. I'm excited to read some version of it at some point once it's different or put together differently.
I think it's a problem when you're saying something that's never really been said before, is that you have to paint the broad strokes before you can get into like the painstaking nitty-gritty. But you can't sell it as if you're not aware of those things or that you don't have answers for those things. Because you're going to get reviewers, since it's not something that's really been said before, you're going to get reviewers who probably are sympathetic to other views, and they're going to say, well, why didn't you talk about that? So maybe there's potential papers after this one to dive into nitty gritty. And you know what, everybody loves for future research ideas, but I need to get the broad strokes down first. Get them out there so I can cite myself. It's gonna feel nice to cite yourself.
Well, and that might be worth noting at the outset, it just as a framing point. Look, there's a lot more work to be done here. I'm just kind of laying the groundwork for future efforts. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, and kind of making that point up front, which can also then alleviate some of the tension with reviewers saying, well, wait a minute, why haven't you addressed literally everything? You say, look, I can't do that in one paper. This is the sort of start of a bigger project. I think that can be really helpful.
Yeah, no, I think you're right there. One of my favorite footnote people is Duns Scotus, because he says things like, he makes a controversial point and says like, I'll write something about this someday. So I don't know, footnote, like you can read this in my book on Oxford University Press in 15 years. Like, I promise I'll get to it. It doesn't quite fly anymore. It doesn't quite be so standard.
Well, if you need a confidence booster, if you bring as much creativity to your paper as you did to the way you framed your talk, you're going to be fine. It was really cool how you like integrated all the different like tweet and like, you know, subtweet and all the different terminology within your presentation was really, really novel.
Thank you. You gotta have fun with it. Like, philosophy is super interesting and fun. There's no reason why we can't be both philosophically rich and have some fun with it. But thank you. I really do appreciate that.
I'm sorry to have basically missed it. I'm on campus at a student orientation today.
No, I saw your comment in the chat earlier, and I appreciate you popping by. I hope the orientation went well.
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, philosophy isn't a major here. So mostly I'm telling them, hey, we have a club and our courses are part of your majors. So look for us. Hi.
Excellent. Yeah, I appreciate you coming by at all. Thank you.
Got to support the team from Wisconsin.
That's right. Where are you in Wisconsin again?
Well, I'm not, but half my family is there or used to be there. My grandmother is still in the greater Milwaukee area.
Cool. It's great. I really have fallen in love with the Midwest. There's no place like it in the States, and I really like it. I'm also noticing your throwback comment here. Damn, Daniel. That was a great meme.
You know, I'm trying to keep it light, but also express how genuinely impressed I am. So, cool. Well, I think that wraps up our session here. Of course, this was amazing. Please join me in a round of applause for Daniel. This is such a cool project. I know what it's like to work on a Descartes project for most of your life. So I hope that this is useful, and I look forward to reading some version of it. Maybe ideally as a referee, a friendly one at that.
I'll take it. No, genuinely, thank you all. This is exactly what I needed. I've been so frustrated with this for about a year now, and this is just like an influx of exciting new ways to think about framing the material and carving out what needs to be said in a way that's digestible. So genuine thanks. You will be getting acknowledgments when this finally hits the press.
Awesome. Okay, so it looks like we have actually a pretty substantial break here. My guess is for lunch. So we are coming back in an hour and a half in room 1 for another Descartes talk. So the hot takes on what you think you know about Descartes just keep coming.
Looking forward to it, Chris.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, I'll try not to say anything too self-congratulatory here, but I'm very excited about this paper. So if you can come back, I'd really appreciate it. So cool.